What's the most haunted location in the world? There are likely as many answers to that as there are haunted places. Castles, museums, theaters, asylums, and prisons are always at the top of that list. But what about residences? Corroboration is always key in determining the legitimacy of a haunting, and the more people who witness it, better the prospect that something supernatural really is taking place there. One home in particular has withstood the test of time, and it took place in my wife's hometown of Bridgeport, Connecticut sometime in the early to mid-1970s, and it just might be the most well-documented case of a poltergeist haunting in all of history. So tie down the furniture, because this is extremely strange. Jerry Gooden was a factory worker employed at Harvey Hubble Incorporated in 1960 when he purchased a 4-room bungalow at 966 Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He and wife Laura had just welcomed a son, Gerard Jr., who suffered from cerebral palsy. Sadly, Gerald Jr. would succumb to the ravages of the disease by the age of 6. The despondent parents would, in less than a year's time, adopt a 4-year-old indigenous Canadian girl named Marcia in 1968. By 1972, 5 years after their son's passing, the Goodens phoned the police after hearing a multitude of strange and unfamiliar noises, such as rhythmic knocking at night, that became something of an annoyance to Jerry, who at first suspected neighborhood kids playing some sort of joke on them, or sounds related to the expansion of St. Vincent's Hospital behind them. He described the sounds as if the house was being stoned from the outside. Jerry went so far as to suspect a developer attempting to build condominiums next door was somehow trying to drive people from their homes to circumvent opposition to the plan, of which Jerry himself was a vocal dissenter. The Goodens even replaced their furnace trying to rid themselves of these bangs and knocks, but despite that, the relentless noises continued. By the fall of 1974, their adopted daughter Marcia, now a 5th grader, was being bullied at school, in large part because of her Iroquois heritage. In October, a boy kicked her violently in the back, injuring the girl, resulting in her having to wear a back brace. At this point, Jerry and Laura pulled her from school and hired a woman named Barbara Carter to be an in-home tutor for her. On November 21st, the wife and daughter of their neighbor, Bridgeport police officer John Holdsworth, were joining them for dinner when they were all startled by the sound of breaking glass. Rushing to find the source, they discovered a pane of the bedroom window had been smashed from the inside out. Then, while watching TV a day later, they heard some odd sounds coming from the master bedroom. When they went into the room, they saw that curtains from one of the windows had fallen to the floor. Laura rehung them, but before she left the room, they fell again. Leaving them where they were, they went back down to the living room, and a half hour later the same curtains were found lying on the kitchen floor. This discovery was followed by more strange knocking sounds that went from a slow and steady tempo into a louder and more rapid banging. When it abruptly stopped after a few minutes, the shaken family decided to try to get some sleep. The following day, the Goodens took a day trip to visit relatives in Dover Plains, New York, and upon their return home, the TV in Marcia's room was found flipped screen down onto her bed. But a trip to the kitchen proved even more unsettling when Jerry saw dishes rise from the sink and literally fly across the room. A knife block that was fastened to a wall came down by itself, forcing Jerry to duck out of the way, and later, as Laura began to put away some groceries, the kitchen table turned itself over, spilling everything to the floor. At this point, the refrigerator slid across the floor and levitated for a good 6 inches, followed by a small 23-inch TV falling from a counter onto Laura's foot, bloodying and injuring her. Things seemed to settle down until dinner was finished, when Jerry claimed to feel a presence again in the kitchen, and Marcia watched as toiletries and towels began to fly around the bathroom while she was in there. It wasn't until 3 a.m. that the Goodens, physically exhausted from the trip and mentally and emotionally drained from this latest ordeal, went to bed. When Jerry went down to the kitchen the following morning, he was once again greeted by the sight of the kitchen table flipped over, and the refrigerator now blocking a door that led outside. Hurrying to the bedroom to tell Laura of this latest phenomenon, a crucifix and a picture of Jesus was seemingly pulled from the wall and fell to the floor. Then another crucifix that was hanging above the door to Marcia's bedroom fell from its nail and broke into pieces upon striking the floor. In another curious display of poltergeist-level activity, chairs in the living room were seen tipping themselves back and forth. At this point, desperate for help, they called neighbors and friends Harold and Mary Hoffman to come to the house. Now fearing impending danger, the family left the house and waited outside, where they saw the daughter of policeman John Holdsworth and asked her to please go and get her father. A few minutes later, Holdsworth entered the home after hearing Jerry and Laura explain what was happening. When he walked into the living room, he watched the TV set rotate on its stand. Recliners began to shake, and the fridge once again slid across the kitchen floor. Not being able to rationally explain what he was witnessing and not knowing what else to do, the shaken police veteran called for backup. Soon a police cruiser carrying officers Carl Leonzi and Joe Tomek arrived at the house. As the two policemen stood in the kitchen, the refrigerator soundlessly rose a half-foot off the floor again, and the TV began to float in midair. Another patrol car arrived with officers George Wilson and Leroy Lawson, and any thought of a hoax was put to rest when the family was separated from each other and the bizarre events continued to happen. A bureau fell in Marcia's room when no one was in there, the fridge once again rose off the floor, and a crucifix hung on a wall began to swing by itself, at first slowly, then picking up speed before disengaging from the wall and striking Officer Lawson in the chest. Lawson would leave the house and not return. Marcia at this point was sitting and listening to the police ask questions and seemed quite calm and content. Had she become desensitized to all of the events taking place at this point? Or was there something underlying that wasn't apparent to anyone yet? As units from the fire department descended on the house after being summoned by the police, the small bungalow was now filled with first responders who watched in equal parts fascination and horror as dishes rattled, chairs moved themselves, and shelves started to vibrate. One of the officers wrote in his report of hearing the Goodens' pet cat Sam actually speak, asking him how his brother Bill was doing. When the officer replied with, "My brother's dead," Sam the cat responded, "I know," then swore at the policeman and ran off. Fire Chief Jack Messina watched the TV tumble over onto the floor, untouched. Fire Chaplain Edward Doyle was summoned and claimed to feel an oppressive energy there and began a house blessing, only to watch as a vial of holy water twice tip over as he reached for it. Their neighbor, Officer Holdsworth, suggested they make recordings of the sounds they were hearing, which, with his help, they eventually did. Before the policeman left the house, Officer Tomek entered Marcia's bedroom. He let out a silent thought to whomever might be in the room: "If you can hear me, move something." With that, items hung on the walls began to come to life. Projecting another thought, he asked that they stop, and they did, all at the same time. Tomek decided on the spot he would keep what just occurred to himself, and continue to do so for the next 40 years. In the summer of 1974, Jerry and Laura believed they saw a disembodied hand at the window. When they ran to check on what they saw, there was no one around. Some weeks later, they were startled by the sound of 3 loud knocks on their front door. While no one was there when Laura went to answer it, she saw 2 wet footprints on the concrete, even though it was a dry evening. By now, all of this had drawn the interest of curious neighbors, and when they saw what was unfolding, one of them, Mary Pasquarella, a member of the Psychic Research Center, who claimed to know a thing or two about the paranormal, claimed this was a poltergeist-type activity and theorized that the catalyst might be Marcia, who was acting as an agent for the activity due to her repressed anger at being bullied and having a somewhat overbearingly protective mother. Mary contacted famed paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, also living in Connecticut, who arrived with a seminary student named Paul Eno and a priest, Father William Carbonneau. They were equally astounded when a recliner Marcia was sitting on rose into the air, flipped over, and unceremoniously dumped her onto the floor as she was speaking to police officers, who then had a difficult time attempting to turn the recliner back over. While the Warrens continued their assessment, police had contacted electric and plumbing inspectors in an attempt to have them find rational explanations for what was going on. No viable reason was found, and the inspectors were told by police in no uncertain terms not to say a word about anything going on in the house. The police would leave that afternoon as things began to calm a bit. The family was told to report anything else out of the ordinary to them, even as they were left with a genuine feeling of helplessness. It was around 4 p.m. when reporters from TV and radio stations converged on the house after catching wind of the strange goings-on, and the event was now becoming a national story as some 2,000 people, some still reeling from the controversial film The Exorcist, released just a couple of years earlier, crowded the normally quiet street to get a look at what was taking place. Police were peppered with questions, snacks were being sold by some enterprising concessionaires, and heads of garlic were thrown at the house. Some in the crowd even claimed to see 2 concrete swan planters on the stoop of the front stairs turned to face each other. By evening, as the crowd swelled, the Warrens returned to the house. Immediately, Lorraine claimed to feel sick to her stomach when she entered, and as they sat at a table, Paul Eno noticed a burn manifesting on her left hand in front of his own eyes as lights began to flicker on and off. Soon Eno began to pick up the scent of sulfur, and Ed Warren became certain this was the work of a poltergeist manifestation. They decided an exorcism was now warranted and left to make the arrangements. By afternoon the following day, the activity began again, when Paul Eno had a hand resting on the kitchen chair where Marcia was sitting. He suddenly felt the chair begin to levitate and attempted to push it back down when he felt the resistance cease with the chair falling back to the floor. During that time, the entity in the home finally chose to reveal itself in the form of a yellow hazy mist that broke off into 4 separate entities which moved in concert around the room. This was followed by an incessant hum loud enough for everyone to hear. One of the entities was said to push its way past Eno, who was protecting Marcia, and pick up the young girl and then toss her to the floor. With that, everyone left the house for their own safety and waited outside until around 9 p.m. when the Warrens returned. When they did, 2 reporters from local WNAB radio station were allowed into the house, where they too saw moving furniture, TVs tipping over, and a host of strange noises. Once inside, chairs and tables began to move by themselves, and Marcia was once again the target of an attack as she was pulled through the kitchen and slammed up against the wall. There was a bitter cold now permeating the house as objects continually moved of their own accord, and things got even more interesting once the Warrens left for the night. One officer who was interviewing Marcia claimed to have seen her try to intentionally flip the recliner she was sitting on over. When one Officer Costello saw her attempt to knock over the TV with her foot, she then told police that in fact, she was the one banging on walls and doors and floors and knocking crucifixes and pictures off the walls. Armed with this information, Police Superintendent Joseph Walsh was eager to tell the press that the whole thing had been a hoax and that Marcia Gooden was to undergo psychiatric evaluation, a claim that Jerry Gooden disputed. From the beginning, Walsh felt the haunting was all in the minds of the witnesses, and that they were victims of the power of suggestion. Now, this explanation probably didn't reflect well on the officers, firemen, and the other independent observers who witnessed all of this hullabaloo, but whether it was spoken or unspoken, they were expected to toe the line with this hoax conclusion. The Warrens came under scrutiny as well, as some claimed they were overreacting and outright embellishing things to enhance their standing as investigators. They were even accused by some of coercing the Goodens into fabricating much of their story for potential gain. When the Goodens came to learn of these doubts being expressed, they would choose to sever ties with Ed and Lorraine. Further fueling their anger with the Warrens was a story Marcia told them of watching Lorraine Warren put her hand under scalding tap water to create her burn mark, a claim vehemently denied by Paul Eno, who watched the burn manifest from no more than 2 feet away. There was also a revelation that Ed used their phone to alert the press to the goings-on there. After hearing of all this, Ed contacted the Goodens, but was rebuffed in any further offers of assistance. Paul Eno visited the property, but was ordered to leave and not come back. For their part, the Goodens vehemently denied any claim that this was an elaborate hoax on their part, and were adamant that their 10-year-old daughter wasn't capable of moving heavy furniture or making things fall in rooms she wasn't even present in. Their feelings, which was actually shared by the Warrens, was that the claims of a hoax by the superintendent were designed to calm the masses and quell the growing public hysteria, though attending officers would eventually claim they were convinced something bizarre and otherworldly was taking place there, as many weird things were happening simultaneously in different areas of the house. So, despite her confession, it's difficult to believe Marcia was responsible for all of it, as she hadn't been present in some rooms or even inside the house when activity was seen firsthand by responders and so many others. And it was unlikely that a 10-year-old girl could have pulled off such an elaborate hoax. So why confess to it? Maybe she was just finally getting some attention and decided she wasn't ready to give it all up yet. Despite the superintendent's intentions, the crowds hardly diminished in size as everyone wanted to lay eyes on the haunted house. One night, a pair of arsons were caught running through the woods behind the house by police after they started a fire near its foundation, claiming to have been attempting to burn the evil from the home. Into the month of December, police continued to patrol Lindley Street, and in time the Goodens simply became worn down by the publicity and the loss of their privacy, as vandals broke windows and occasionally egged their house. The activity also ramped up again, with furniture, televisions, and so forth behaving in the same manner as before. When they would return to the house after leaving for a few hours, everything would be in disarray with items strewn about the place. It became at this point even clearer to the Goodens that their adopted daughter was not responsible for much, if any, of the phenomena happening inside the house. On December 16th, Jerry received a call from an investigator with the American Society for Psychical Research named Boyce Beatty, who claimed he could help them and keep everything confidential. A meeting was set up at the house on December 18th. On that day, Beatty arrived at the house with investigators Blue Harary and Jerry Solvin. What the family was unaware of was that the men had already spoken with Ed Warren, who had shared with them what he knew about the case. The police department was notified of their presence there and pledged to help as long as their involvement was kept quiet, which suited the Goodens and Beatty just fine. The investigation continued through December, and the group managed to witness much of the same activity as others had during their tenure there. It was then that they reached a conclusion, not unlike others before them, that the phenomena was indeed real, but it had elements of a typical poltergeist-type haunting. It surrounded the Goodens' overbearing parenting style and the resulting unhappiness unfolding around Marcia. The stresses had also weighed on Jerry and Laura as well, resulting in what Beatty termed a pathological environment, which set the stage for these disturbances, mainly displaying themselves when someone new came into the house, which fell in line with first responders, reporters, and investigators bearing witness to them. It's often been theorized that an adolescent, more likely a female, might be the catalyst or agent that manifests object manipulation, and sometimes even the manifestation of physical entities via psychokinesis, otherwise known as PK. And in some cases, it might not only create supernatural phenomena, but attract existing phenomena as well. By January of 1975, with activity seeming to calm a bit, Jerry and Laura put the house on the market with an asking price of $21,500. It remained there for a full year with no takers, even after Jerry put in the work to paint the house and try to remove any distinguishing features, like the twin swans on the stoop. But the house was never sold. Jerry and Laura would live out their lives there, and were still there when the condos, which Jerry had once opposed, were built in 1987. Laura died from injuries suffered in a car crash in 1993 at the age of 68. Jerry passed away of natural causes 4 years later at the age of 78. Sometime in the 1980s, Marcia moved back to her native Canada. Apparently estranged from her adoptive parents, she passed away in February of 2015 at the age of 51. The house remains empty and is still on the market as of today. Now, many of the witnesses, including the owners, are no longer with us, but though some 49 years have passed since the Goodins first heard knocks on the walls of their home, the story of the happenings at 966 Lindley Street endure. An excellent book on the subject called The World's Most Haunted House by William Hall covers the story in more detail than we ever could here. You should pick it up. But in the end, this just might be the most well-documented report of a poltergeist haunting ever recorded. And for the people who lived it, saw it, and documented it, it would change their lives forever.